Welcome to the 13th lecture of this massive open online course on philosophical foundations of social research. If you look at this, this is going to be the last lecture of the 5th week. In the 5th week, in terms of 2 lectures, we have already discussed Marx's delineation of the debates on the relationship or rather controversies about idealism and materialism, then materialist conception of history and principles of dialectic. And in today's lecture, what we are going to do? We are going to discuss understanding ideology, understanding nature, understanding science, and what are the methodological implications. Then we will start with understanding nature, then theory of ideology, and then theory of science or knowledge. If you slightly recall, we have discussed Marx's materialist conception of history, or popularly known as historical materialism. What is historical in historical materialism and what is materialism in historical materialism? That historical entails the analysis of how particular forms of society have come into existence and the specific historical contexts within which apparently universal or eternal social forms are located. We have discussed how particular forms of society, in terms of hunting and gathering economy, the slave society, the feudal society, the capitalist society, which will inevitably and unstoppably move on to socialism and thereafter communism. And when I said apparently universal or eternal social forms, they only appear to us as universal or eternal social forms, but actually they are not. In reality, they are not. They may be state, religion, and market, and so on. And materialism denotes rejection of Hegelian idealism and the primacy of socio-economic processes and relations. That's how we have tried to classify historical materialism under three broad spectrums: general theory of historical materialism, particular theories of historical materialism, and regional theories of historical materialism. When we have discussed dialectic, we started with Hegelian form of 3 movements in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and then we moved on to Marx's delineation of dialectic to account for social and historical events. Engels extended the scope of dialectical analysis to establish it as a general law of development, that is in social, natural, and intellectual spheres. Then we have discussed how drawing upon Hegel's dialectic and Feuerbach's materialism, both Engels and Marx, they tried to develop dialectical and historical materialism. When Engels was deeply engrossed in the dialectic of nature, Marx found out their social applicability in the course of development of society. And there are 3 principles of dialectic that we have already discussed. Quantitative changes lead to qualitative changes and vice versa. Interpenetration of opposites, unity and struggle of opposites, and the law of negation, the principle of negation of negation. And today we are going to discuss understanding nature, man-nature relationships, theory of ideology, and theory of science. Human history is a part of history of nature when we do this. When I say human history is a part of history of nature, it is basically a movement of nature developing towards man. Marx always talked about unity of science. According to him, natural science will in time incorporate into itself the science of man, just as science of man will incorporate itself into science of nature. There will be one science. The social reality of nature and natural history of man are identical terms for Marx. Let me give you a prefatory remark before we move further. If you look at the way nature has been conceptualized, or the relationship between man and nature has been conceptualized, earlier notion was that nature controls everything. human beings are always controlled by nature. As a consequence of which, human beings were expected to contemplate on nature, worship nature. But with the coming in of the industrial revolution, with the changes in the mode of production, with the changes in our intellectual and political consciousness marked by modernity and the associated institutions of modernity, what we tend to see that human beings stopped contemplating on nature, rather they started controlling nature. How? No, because nature was not regarded as a subject in the age of capitalism. Nature became an object of reality. Human beings tried to control over nature, human beings tried to master over nature. Okay? That earlier contemplation phase that human beings used to contemplate on nature, we used to worship nature, there is a transition from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control in the age of capitalism. That one has to understand. Okay? That is why that when that transition happened, that from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control, I mean nature was earlier regarded as a subject, human beings object, and now human beings are considered subjects and nature as an object of reality. And that is how human beings have started mastering over nature, have started controlling nature. And in this sense, one must understand there is a transition of faculty of transition from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control. And in this sense, many perceptive thinkers, including Marx, try to understand the dialectical relationship between man and nature, between human beings and nature. Okay? In this sense, we are trying to understand Marx's delineation of nature and man-nature relationship. Marx never studied nature as an isolated category, or Marx never studied human beings as an isolated category. Marx always tried to study nature or human beings as complementary to each other. There must be a dialectical relationship between nature and human beings. Okay? For Marx, man is the immediate object of natural science and nature is the immediate object of science of man. Sense perceptions are the basis of all sciences. Sensuousness of man is human sensuousness. Sensuousness, when I say sensuousness of man is human sensuousness, I mean sensuousness is looked at only by looking at others. A human being, suppose man A, can be known only when she or he interacts with man B. I cannot understand man A or man B as isolated categories. I will try to examine man A or man B on the basis of the kind of interaction that they have with each other. I cannot understand an individual as an isolated category. I will try to understand, I will try to examine that individual through the ways in which that individual interacts with our economy, our culture, our polity, I mean society at large. And in this sense, you will find human actions change the world, change our nature. That is why by acting upon nature, human beings not only may change nature, but also change themselves or social relations. We will discuss this in the next slide. That is why through human action, through human labor, okay, we tend to change the world, we tend to change the nature. And Marx in this context emphasized the notion of praxis. Praxis is very important. Praxis is nothing but practice. Okay? The single science refers to the science of history for Marx. What is that that science we want to talk about in the context of nature, in the context of man-nature relationships. What is that science? No, there cannot be any other science, but the only science that human civilization has, that is the science of history. Science of history is a composite product of history of nature 1 and history of man 2. When I said science of history is a composite product of history of nature and history of man, and history of nature and history of man condition each other. Nature, as nature cannot be cannot be treated as an isolated category, man also cannot be treated, or human beings cannot be treated as an isolated category. And in this context, Marx emphatically mentioned that man lives in and against nature. Man tries to cope with nature, in nature, and also tries to live against nature. I mean, when I said man lives in nature, then man, in fact, I mean, human beings are essentially natural. We are natural species. We cannot live independent of nature. But at the same time, when Marx said man lives against nature, then human beings not only try to cope with nature, but also try to control over nature, try to master over nature. When human beings try to control nature or master over nature, it implies that man lives against nature. That is why Marx said man lives in and against nature. Okay? And science or knowledge that comes from the conflict with and acting upon nature. If you look at this, then you will find that how man tries to live in and against nature, man tries to act upon nature, okay? And by acting upon nature, if you look at this, man tends to change nature, I mean our nature also changes, and when we say that, when we see that our nature has changed, in a way even man has changed himself. I mean, human beings have changed themselves. That is why by acting upon nature, human beings not only change nature, but also change themselves. When they change themselves, as individual entity, not only as an individual entity we have changed, but the social relations have changed. This is very important. Only as an individual entity we have changed, no doubt about it. But how? But by changing ourselves, we have also changed our social relationships, economic relationships, political relationships, cultural relationships, and so on. We have always tried to do that. Okay? I repeat that how man lives in and against nature, and knowledge comes from the conflict with and acting upon nature, and by acting upon nature, human beings not only change nature, but also change themselves, and while changing themselves, they also change the social relations of production. Okay? It is through practice, okay? Practice you can say praxis also you can say. It is through practice that we know and change the world. It is only through practice that we not only know the world, but also we know how to change the world, change our nature, change our real world phenomena. It is only through praxis, it is only through practice. It is only through practice that we have tried to evolve our norms, rules, regulations. Okay? But once rules, regulations, norms they evolve, okay, they also tend to change our practice. That is why you will find that we have not mentioned that there is only one way relationship between practice, nature, knowledge and human nature. There is also once human nature changes, then I mean it also tends to develop different attitudes, and attitudes lead to different forms of knowledge. When once knowledge changes, nature also changes, nature also can change for the forms of practice. I mean there is a dialectical process, there is a dialectical relationship between practice, nature, knowledge and human nature. It is only, but primarily it is praxis through which we know and change the world. Then what is that practice that no that we tend to do, we tend to act upon something many a time independent of the structure itself, we do not know. But it is through praxis, it is through agency, okay, it is through action, okay, that we tend to know the world, understand the world. Had there been no praxis, then we would not have been able to know the world, change the world. For example, Mao Zedong, he was the main leader of the People's Republic of China. When China became independent in 1949, he was the main leader. He led the socialist revolution in China, peasantry revolution in China for a pretty long period of time. What he talked about, Marx's version of practice. Mao Zedong said, it is only through practice that we can enjoy the fruits of technological development. One may say that no, we have developed technology, we have developed science, we have developed so many things, but it is only when larger section of the population, they tend to enjoy the fruits of those technological developments, then only will we be able to say that yes, it is through practice that we have been able to. Otherwise, there is no point. You may say that no, X has happened, Y has happened, Z has happened, but if I do not use X, Y, Z in certain words and practice it, then there is no meaning of such X, Y, Z. It is only through practice that we tend to generate knowledge, we tend to know the world, we tend to change the world. That is why Mao Zedong said that the proof of apple is in its eating. How can I know that it is an apple? Because everybody says that it is an apple, but if I can't taste it, if I can't eat it, then there is no proof that this is an apple or not. It's a very conventional example that the British used to say the taste of pudding lies in its eating, and Mao Zedong said the proof of apple lies in its eating. And the dialectical process that Marx tried to develop, and then Mao also tried to develop in this manner, that there is a dialectical, the dialectical process can be captured through this, that there is a dialectical relationship between practice or praxis, nature, knowledge and human nature. Okay. That according to Mao Zedong, a multiplicity of contradictions is hierarchical in a social formation. Some principal contradictions subordinate several other contradictions. Nature, according to Marx, does not build machines. Machines are essentially the products of the products of human labor. That is why Marx has mentioned at umpteen numbers of places that nature builds no machines, no locomotives, no railways, no telegraphs. No, I mean it is the byproduct of human labor, human activity. Indeed, Marx mentioned that Darwin has made God redundant, and capitalism limits civilizing force of science, and in capitalism nature becomes in capitalism nature becomes denatured. Because human beings try to control nature, human beings try to master over nature. This is a part of industrial revolution. Even in the 21st century, you can see that how we have tried to destroy nature. Okay. And humanity, if nature becomes denatured, humanity also has become dehumanized. And nature becomes an object of reality, becomes a object of utility, and becomes a raw material, and so on. But what Marx tried to prescribe against that, if we cannot make a transition from capitalism to socialism and thereafter communism, okay, then nature will become denatured, humanity becomes dehumanized already in capitalism. But there must be a superior mode of production where you will find that nature becomes humanized and man becomes naturalized. Human beings become naturalized. Okay? I mean, that is why capitalism limits civilizing force of science. In capitalism, nature becomes denatured and humanity becomes dehumanized. Nature becomes a raw material or an object of reality, and understanding life at a genetic level, at a molecular level, will be reductionist. Today, what people say that no, we have to understand life as a pool of genes, only at the level, at the genetic level, at the molecular level. And obviously, there is some kind of reductionism involved in this, that technological reasoning and economic reasoning, okay, have become inseparable today. Okay. If you talk about any technology, then we always talk about economics. Okay. And such kind of reasoning becomes reductionist in nature. Okay. That is what Marx says. Okay. If this is the idea that Marx had while reflecting on methodological arguments in social science research, okay, then we have to discuss theory of ideology by Marx. Much of Marx's and Engels' discussion on ideology is metaphorical in nature. What are metaphors? What is a metaphor? A metaphor refers to the similar characteristics that at least two variables will have, but actually they are not identical terms. If I say Virat Kohli runs like a hare, runs like a deer, because he runs very fast. A.B. de Villiers runs like a deer, hare. In this case, they have the similar characteristics that they run very fast, but they are not deer and Virat Kohli or deer, hare and A.B. de Villiers, they are not identical terms. They are just metaphors. It is a metaphoric, we try to capture them metaphorically. Okay? And in this sense, according to Marx, ideologies are nothing but fantasies, illusions, reflections, inverted images, echoes of material life, and so on. Many, but not all of these metaphors contain two theses about ideology. One thesis concerns its status as a reality, and the other its status as knowledge. When I say knowledge, I mean the cognitive status. What I have in is knowledge, when I say it, is the book view and reality, what I say, it is the field view. If you look at M.N. Srinivasa's The Field Worker in the Field, you will find the distinction between book view and field view. In fact, there should not be any distinction now. I mean, they must mutually complement each other, book view and field view. That is why reality, I mean, the argument concerns its status, I mean the status of these metaphors as a reality, and the other status as knowledge, okay, its cognitive status. There must be a complementary relationship, they must constitute a symbiosis and symbiotic relationship. For Marx, there are always one way causal links between material life and ideology. Material life, mode of production, they always try to determine what kind of ideology that people are going to have. That is why there are always one way for Marx, that is why there are always one way causal links between material life and ideology, and that ideology is nothing but an insubstantial epiphenomenon for Marx. What is that insubstantial epiphenomenon? Now, insubstantial epiphenomenon means a reflection which depicts but does not affect the course of a real historical life. That is why according to Marx, that ideology is an insubstantial epiphenomenon, that is a reflection which only depicts but does not affect the course of real historical life. That is why material life is more important than ideology. Material life determines what kind of ideology that we are going to have. In the German ideology, okay, Marx said that materialism consists in asserting that thoughts are the phenomena, and material life, their essence. But idealism suggested that no, material life is the phenomenon and thoughts are its essence, and materialism suggests that no, thoughts are the phenomena and material life their essence, as against the idealist's assertion of the converse. The later formulations in the works of, for example, Lukács and others, that determination in the last instance and relative autonomy of the superstructures are clearly the attempts to correct the lapses into economic reductionism. If ideology is a dependent variable, for Marx, material life is an independent variable. Okay? This is very important. But Marx was very much clear about the relationship between material life and ideology. That is why he said that ideology cannot be an independent variable. That is why I always have mentioned that Marx must be examined, Marx must be evaluated not simply as an ideologue of the Communist Party, but also as a top notch theoretician. If you look at this, then according to Marx, in quest of truth, in quest of knowledge, one has to go beyond the narrow confinements of his or her ideology. Even Marx said this while dwelling upon ideologies in general and the German ideology in particular. That is why it is very important that much of Marx's and Engels' discussion on ideology, which is metaphorical in character, for Marx, ideologies, that is why as a theoretician, as a theorist, Marx suggests that ideologies are fantasies, illusions, reflections, inverted images and echoes of material life. Many, but not all of these metaphors contain two theses about ideology. One thesis concerns the status of ideology as a reality and the other as a status of the other its status as knowledge, its cognitive status. That ideology, if you look at Marx's writings, that for Marx there are only one way causal links between material life and ideology, that ideology is an insubstantial phenomenon. In the German ideology, Marx said that what is that insubstantial epiphenomenon? That a reflection which depicts but does not affect the real, does not affect the course of real historical life. Okay. In the German ideology, Marx said that materialism consists in asserting that thoughts are the phenomenon and material life their essence, as against the idealists' assertion of the converse. The later formulations, determination in the last instance and relative autonomy of the superstructures, are clearly the attempts to correct the lapses into economic reductionism. If ideology is a dependent variable, then mode of production or material life becomes an independent variable. However, in quest of truth, in quest of knowledge, one has to purge upon, one has to go beyond the narrow confinements of ideologies, his or her ideology. Even Marx said this while dwelling upon ideologies in general and the German ideology in particular. And that is how Marx becomes a theorist. Marx tries to go beyond the narrow confinements of his ideology as an ideologue of the Communist Party. And then Marx as a theorist, Marx as a theoretician, he tries to look at the theory of science, because he always talked about unity of science, if you can slightly recall. Okay. The theory of science, or rather Marx's theory of science, can be understood by analyzing and examining two of Marx's texts on scientific methodology. What are these two? Now, one is the German ideology, and secondly the methods of political economy. Okay. From the two texts that we have just mentioned here, the German ideology and the methods of political economy, from these two texts, 6 arguments follow, 6 theses follow. This is very important. These two texts are very important so far as the scientific methodology is concerned by Marx. For Marx, what are those 6 theses then? 6 theses. For Marx, the positive science of history is the representation of the practical activity, of the practical process of development of man. Then whatever we do, it must be found at the level of praxis. Representation, the positive science of history. Okay. As you have seen in the case of positivism, in the case of inductivism and so on, that they always try to start with science must start with observations, experience and so on. As hypothesists said that no, science must start with a hypothesis. Okay. It is, for Marx, it is only through practical activity of the practical process of development of human beings that we talk about positive science of history. Then if the first one is the positive science of history is the representation of the practical activity of the practical process of development of men, then this representation or depiction consists in the observation and arrangement of historical material under the guidance of certain premises, which are themselves to be made evident by the study of the material life of each historical epoch. That is why these premises, these axioms, they are the first principles of the theoretical system of history. When you look at this, I mean, what is a premise? Premise is an axiom in this sense. Okay? And these premises are historically conditioned. The kind of premise that we had seen in the 20th century, even 30 years back or 20 years back, we do not see those premises today. Premises change over time, our axioms change over time across space and so on. Okay? That is why this representation, I mean this representation of what? Now, this representation of practical activity of the practical process of development of man, or such depiction of practical activity of the practical process of development of men, consists in the observation and arrangement of historical material under the guidance of certain premises which are themselves to be made evident. That is why they are called the first principles or axioms, which are they are themselves to be made evident by the study of the material life of each historical epoch. Premises in this sense are the axioms or first principles of the theoretical system of history. Okay? This is important. Axioms, the first principles. Why they are first principles or axioms? No, precisely because they are themselves to be made evident by the study of the material life of each historical epoch. Okay? Whether it is, I mean, slavery or feudalism or capitalism and so on. The term premises, first principles, when I said, the term premises refers to starting points in the real world from which the concrete study of history must proceed. And these premises are basic facts of social life, the real individuals, their activity and the material conditions under which they live. These premises, the given, the raw data of scientific historical investigation can be verified in a purely empirical way and are empirically perceptible. Then Marx's method goes back to empiricism, inductivism, and I mean that empirical, that it must start with observations, it must start with experience, it must start with practice and so on. And he goes back to positivism, that it must be verified in a purely empirical way. That if you slightly recall, we have discussed how what is the hallmark of science according to positivists. Now, that the hallmark of science lies in the fact that all scientific statements must be systematically verifiable. Okay? That is why, so far as Marx's method is concerned, the premises that he talks about, he tries to foreground the premises as axioms, as first principles of the theoretical system of history. These premises become the starting points in the real world from which the concrete study of history must proceed. And these premises are basic facts of social life, the real individuals, their activity and the material conditions under which they live. And these premises, the given, the raw data of scientific historical investigation, can be verified in a purely empirical way and are empirically perceptible. Okay? Then does it imply that Marx's method is nothing but empirical method or positivistic method? Or one can say that no, as he was so much about science, about material life and so on, was he just, I mean, was Marx's method only rationalist in nature? No. Okay? It is much beyond that. For Marx, I mean, as he propounded the materialist method, the materialist method differs from that of the empiricists, because for the empiricists history is a collection of dead facts. That is why Marx always emphasized that no, we not only try to interpret the world, but the main thing is to change it, change the world. That is the thesis 11. I mean, the last thesis of the thesis on Feuerbach, that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. That is why the materialist method tries to change the world, not simply interpret the world, but also try to change the world. It does not imply that interpretation is not important. Interpretation is extremely important, but what the materialist method suggests, Marx's materialist method suggests that no, we must go beyond interpretation and we must try to change the world. Change the world, change nature. It is only through practice we can change the world. We can know the world as well as change the world. Okay? Then where empiricists have faltered? No. What have empiricists done for Marx? For empiricists, history is a collection of dead facts. They only try to capture reality, but they do not know how to change the world. One, he made a scathing attack on positivists and empiricists. Then Marx suggested that the materialist method is not speculative, as metaphysicists do. Instead, it starts with observable and verifiable facts. When he said that the materialist method is not speculative as metaphysicists do, I mean, if you slightly recall, we have discussed metaphysical stage in Comte's law of stages. I mean, theological stage, metaphysical stage, positivistic or scientific stage. Okay. Whether the proponents of theological stage or metaphysical stage, they always try to speculate, especially metaphysicists, they always try to speculate. If I am teaching in this life, then in the other life what I will do? That is speculation. But the materialist method does not engage in this kind of thing. The materialist method rather always starts with observable and verifiable facts. It is not speculative in nature. And the premises, the axioms, the first principles of the theoretical system of history, upon which metaphysics and broadly philosophy has been based, govern empirical investigations. They do not want to change it. Okay. In this sense, the materialist method propounded by Marx is different from that of empiricists as well as metaphysicists. Okay. Then what we have discussed till now? We have discussed in this week, because we are going to close, I mean, we are going to complete the lectures of the 5th week. I mean, all 13 lectures are over. I mean, from the next week we are going to have the 14th one. I mean, Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn will discuss. I mean, but what we have discussed in this week, that we have discussed Marx's materialist conception of history, popularly known as historical materialism, and we have discussed what is historical in historical materialism and materialism in historical materialism. Then we have discussed how we have classified historical materialism into 3 important arenas. One is the general theory of historical materialism, then particular theories of historical materialism, and regional theories of historical materialism. Then we have discussed the principles of dialectic, I mean, how quantitative changes lead to qualitative changes and vice versa, interpenetration of the opposites, I mean, unity and struggle of opposites, and then we have discussed the law of negation or the principle of negation, and then we have discussed Marx's understanding of nature, man-nature relationships, how we have made a transition from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control, because earlier nature was regarded as the subject and human beings were regarded as objects of utility. earlier notion was that nature controls human behavior, human action. That is why human beings were expected to contemplate on nature, human beings were expected to worship nature, nature could not be questioned or so. But with the coming in of capitalism, modernity, industrial revolution and so on, what we tend to see that human beings started controlling nature, human beings started mastering over nature, and thereby we tend to see a transition from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control. I mean, when we say the transition has happened from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control, I mean, in capitalism, human beings are regarded as subjects, whereas nature is regarded as raw material, as an object of utility. If you look at this, then we have moved on to theory of ideology, how we have discussed how ideologies are of fantasies, illusions, reflections, inverted images, echoes of material life and so on, and how ideology is an insubstantial epiphenomenon in Marx's schema, Marx's scientific methodology, and according to him, in quest of truth, in quest of knowledge, one has to go beyond the narrow confinements of her or his ideology. That is very important. And then we have discussed theory of science or theory of knowledge on the basis of Marx's two important works. One is the German ideology and the methods of political economy. And there we have discussed how the positive science of history is a representation of the practical activity, of the practical process of development of human beings or man. I mean, human beings, this representation or depiction consists in the observation and arrangement of historical material under the guidance of certain premises, which are themselves to be made evident by the study of the material life of each historical epoch. And premises in this sense are axioms or the first principles of the theoretical system of history. And we have also discussed how the term premises refers to the starting points in the real world from which the concrete study of history must proceed. These premises are basic facts of social life, I mean the real individuals, their activity and the material conditions under which they live, and these premises, the given, the raw data of scientific historical investigation can be verified in a purely empirical way and are empirically perceptible. We have also discussed how the Marxist materialist method differs from that of the empiricists, for whom history is a collection of dead facts. And last but not the least, as we have discussed, how Marxist materialist method is not speculative as metaphysicists do. Instead, Marxist materialist method always starts with observable and verifiable facts, and the premises of metaphysics or broadly philosophy govern empirical investigations. And we are going to enter the sixth week from the next lecture, and in the sixth week, I mean the sixth week will have 4 lectures, 2 on Karl Popper and 2 on Thomas Kuhn. We are going to discuss, I mean, Popper and Kuhn, the debates within philosophy of science broadly and social science research in particular. If you look at this, I mean these the debates between Popper and Kuhn, they are considered one of the most intellectually stimulating controversies, debates within philosophy of science in particular and social science research in general. Okay. We will have 2 lectures each on Karl Popper and Thomas Samuel Kuhn. That in Popper we are going to discuss principle of falsification, context of discovery and justification, hypothetico-deductive model, verisimilitude and so on. And in Kuhn we are going to discuss how paradigms change, how we tend to forge a paradigm on the basis of a consensus. And Kuhnian model of scientific method. If you look at this, then you will find that every major science passes through 2 important phases. One is pre-paradigmatic phase and the other paradigmatic phase. And under paradigm, the transition from pre-paradigmatic stage to paradigmatic stage is marked by forging some kind of consensus, some kind of uniformity of practice. Okay? Within a paradigm we will find normal science, norm bound science, then we will find anomalies, I mean unexpected or unanticipated occurrences or happenings, then crisis, and then we will arrive at a new paradigm mediated by a revolutionary science. Okay? Then in the 14th and 15th lecture we are going to discuss Popper, and in the 16th and 17th lecture we are going to discuss Kuhn. Thank you.